One question to open it up for all of you, actually. Can you tell us, when did you become aware of the story of Circus Kathmandu, and how did you decide to get involved with it, and why did you want to tell that story?
Thank you all for coming. Yeah, amazing to see so many familiar faces here as well. So this journey began in 2010, and at the time I was a practicing circus artist, and I'd also been working as a documentary filmmaker. And I'd heard about, I love India, I love circus, and I saw a post advertising for circus artists to go and join a circus in India, and I was really intrigued by this idea. I thought I could go with a camera, go and make a film. That didn't end up happening. Two of my friends ended up going, and when they were there, the circus that they went to ended up getting raided by a charity, an NGO. Because there were trafficked girls from Nepal in that circus. So I kind of heard about that story through them. And I followed up, I contacted the NGO, and they were, at the time, they were actually starting to come to the idea that maybe, like looking at the idea of bringing a kind of therapeutic performing sort of program might be something that could work within their refuge. So they had a refuge with something like 70% kids that had been returned from circuses. And they were already, as you saw in the film, starting to build these programs of creative programs, really. And they were thinking about adding a program that could potentially give them space to sort of just be creative in a way that they, had done as you see in the film. So I went out initially as a consultant, really, to sort of help the charity to think about developing that program. And yeah, that's kind of how. So I had a camera with me as well at the time, and that's really where the film journey began.
And at what point did you guys decide to make this film together?
That was the second time you went out. Sky and I had studied visual anthropology together, so we'd been working a bit together in the UK. And Sky told me about the story when she came back the first time. It seemed really interesting. Initially, I just went out to help, but became really kind of hooked on the story, and working together was really working. So we decided to co-direct it from there. That was 2011, I think, the beginning. Yeah.
I mean, it's been an incredibly long journey. You mentioned, Elhum, in your introduction that it's been 7 years since this journey began. So when did you come in and started collaborating with Sky and Kate?
I think around 2014.
Yeah.
So we actually all studied together 12 years ago, and didn't really know each other that well then. But I'd heard of this story in the background that they were making, and it just always seems amazing to me. And I came on board more formally in 2014, and kind of, it just seemed like a story that had to be out there. I think one of the things that's most interesting to me is that all the time that we were trying to make the film, there was a lot of, one of the responses that we kept getting was this I don't understand. I don't really understand why. So they were in a circus and now they're in a circus. I don't get it. And hopefully the film now answers that question. And I think it really shows how we don't talk about narratives like this as narratives of survival. And these young people constantly being put back into a position of victimhood. And we really wanted to make a film that challenged that, because what they were doing was so amazing, to reframe that narrative themselves. And I think that was one of the things that struck you the most the first time you met.
And actually just thinking that as well, like, I think from that first trip there was a kind of definite turning point where, me going and meeting these girls that actually couldn't even say that they were from the circus. Like, there was so much stigma and so much sort of shame associated, and when they met me it was like, oh, you're a circus girl as well. And I think that was a kind of real place of camaraderie that we had that started from the off, really. And I think that sort of set the platform for us to be able to go over and work together with a common kind of language and common understanding of something. And I was able to show them on that first trip, like, clips of circus happening around the world, and get them to sort of see that actually there was this incredible thing happening around the world.
I mean, collaboration is very much at the heart of the project since the very beginning, it seems. Yeah. So how did you work with them as well during your travels and throughout the many years as you were shooting the project?
I think that's something that developed over time. It was always something that we wanted to aim for, and from the start, there was a kind of connection that was made on that very first trip. And I think that in the making of the film, we wanted to try and continue that collaborative process. So it wasn't us making a film about them, but with them. Yeah. And that, at first, was harder, although they were willing to share with us and wanted to. You know, there was issues of how best to do that, and I think there was another real turning point when we decided to incorporate circus into the filmmaking, because that was a language they knew and that was something that they could really express and excel in. And once we decided to make that kind of hybrid film, things started to flow a lot better then.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about, I mean, I'm sure there were many over the course of the making, but what were the main challenges that you found in telling the story? Like you mentioned, Elhum, at the beginning that
I don't understand.
I don't get what the story is, which seems very evident now.
I mean, I won't go on too much. This subject fascinates and infuriates me. I think we don't understand women within narratives of survival. You know, we understand the situation of trafficking only as a victimhood story. And we felt this all the way through the process of making this film. It happens when, you know, it happens within press. Rather than look at the achievements, people always look to the trauma of the backstory because that's so much more interesting, supposedly. And it doesn't enable someone to challenge that narrative, doesn't enable them to move past that or to become anything beyond that. It keeps them within that label. And so that, to me, is one of the main challenges. And, you know, anytime you want to go against a mainstream narrative, that is going to be a challenge. But it's like this double stigmatization, this endless stigmatization. And I think what Circus Kathmandu has managed to do is incredible. And it's really fantastic that Sheetal and Saraswoti and other members of Circus Kathmandu have started traveling with the film, and they stand up and they talk proudly about what they do, and they use it as a further tool to challenge that stigma, and that's amazing. So the fact that people are still sometimes trying to drag them back into a space that they're actively challenging, I think it says a lot about our world and power dynamics and power structures. And interesting to think that we're releasing the film next week, and I'm curious to see whether there will be a change in how it's responded to in light of the Me Too movement and this kind of more widespread understanding of power dynamics, or even just believing the fact that women do have, you know, a different position in this world, and this world isn't made for women. They live within it, and they have to live with these structures. And they're defined by them. Anyway, I won't go on. I could keep going on that topic.
And can you talk a little bit about update us a little bit on what Circus Kathmandu has been up to since you actually finished the film and throughout the process of kind of editing it, and now that you're readying the release?
So you touched on it there, but they've just received a grant to be working with the film, touring it around the border between India and Nepal, using it similar way to the way they use theatre in the scene towards the end, showing it in communities and using it as a jumping off point to have discussions and workshops and with people. So it's become something now that's there's a real ownership around it. So that's just kicking off at the moment. It's getting designed and kicking off in May. So
Comic relief.
Yeah. So that's the next thing.
That's brilliant. We don't have that much time for the Q&A, so I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to ask questions. So if you have anything that you want to ask our guests, please put your hand up, and we've got roving mics that can come to you.
I mean, I think at that point, they sort of came later, and I think we'd really developed quite a kind of relationship with the girls, and it really kind of those scenes really came actually from, you know, I think we were working very, very collaboratively with them. We were showing them scenes along the way, and at that point we were like, you know, how do we take this story further? And actually it was them that wanted to go and speak to their mums, and I think they really kind of, both those girls really embraced and flew with the filmmaking process and really wanted to kind of use it themselves. So I think knowing that, so we were kind of a team really, I think, at that point, and going into those environments, and from the very off, the mothers were very embracing, and it kind of was just very natural actually, and it just felt very kind of natural, and that everybody wanted to be there talking and sharing.
And in a way it was almost like the filmmaking process was creating a space that certain conversations could be had that perhaps wouldn't have been had that situation not been set up. And I certainly think Sheetal and Saraswoti used it in that way at times, as almost a prompt to create a space where the families could have very difficult conversations, and some of those conversations hadn't been had before. So that was quite special in a way.
I mean, I think it was absolutely crucial to what we were doing from the very beginning that they understood what they were getting involved with. So just to start by, that was always built in throughout, really. And we were very aware of the fact at the beginning that there wasn't going to be a kind of very clear understanding. So therefore we cared about that a lot and built that in and showed them things and talked to them about how to sort of tell the story. So I think when we first showed them the kind of on a screen, then I think that it was kind of quite. I mean, it was big. It was big, wasn't
scary
it?
For
it was
us,
big and scary.
But it wasn't a surprise.
For them, I don't think so. And actually, I think it was moving, but they weren't surprised by anything, and they were very, very happy. And I think the thing that I loved the most with Saraswati just was like, I'm so happy to be able to show my children my story. That was a real big thing for her to be able to share that.
And then Sheetal, talked about what her favourite scene was, for example, and that was when they're on the roof, just the two girls talking, and she says some pretty profound stuff there that I think was really special for her to express. So that was really good to hear, because they make themselves quite vulnerable. So that the fact that they kind of own that now is really important and a great relief.
And I think watching it on a big screen was quite a big thing. Like, I think there was a few tears for the first time, wasn't there, with Sheetal, but they've since we went to Doha Film Festival and they both came and did a Q&A, and they have really they're taking ownership of their stories and how it's being represented as well. You were in Nepal. How did you feel?
Yeah, I mean, the audience in Nepal was amazing. I think people felt very humbled to actually see such a long journey and to realize really kind of all of these different hurdles and steps and actually what it means to see the Circus Kathmandu are quite well known in Kathmandu now. So I think to really understand the full breadth of their journey was quite moving at home in Nepal. I think from our previews here, what I've really loved is the response around the complexity of the film, because so often when you're telling stories you're told to simplify because audiences like bite-sized things, where actually this isn't really a film that's saying this is good, that's bad. It's saying this is really complicated and it stays complicated. And I think that's what people have been responding to the most. And that's really reassuring, because actually embracing the complications of this world is probably going to help us understand it a bit better.
I mean, I think we touch on it a bit in the film in terms of the kind of coercion or the sort of manipulative, your kids are going to get a better life. And I think that was the thing that we most probably came across as filmmakers. That seemed to be the narrative that came up a lot, really, I think, was that there was a huge vulnerability, and a lot of that vulnerability was because of the poverty. It was also because of a caste system, and there was a kind of, it seemed to be a vulnerability based on caste, that someone is considered an uncle even if they're very sort of distant, and so therefore there's a trust there, and so there's a sort of big space for vulnerability. So that's something we found along the way, I guess. So I think that was the kind of main narrative.
So there's members of the community that are part of the chain. So it'll be people you perhaps trust or know, or literal family members sometimes, that are passing on, and it's situations of desperation that a lot of these kids are coming out of. So it's kid number 7, or and they're having a hard time feeding the others. So often it is a lot of promises, and very little money is changed hands most of the time, and it's none often. So it's just a lot of hope.
I think it's worth noting that trafficking is one of the fastest growing criminal activities in the world, and there's a value to human life. And one of the things that Circus Kathmandu is now doing with the comic relief funding that we have and with the film is to work with an ethical recruitment agency so that they're not going into. One of the reasons why trafficking happens and is so prevalent is because it responds to a need, and so ethical recruitment might be an answer to that need, and ironically might not be the first option for families because it's a slightly newer way of looking at responding to that need, if that makes sense. So we're trying to make sure that the film has a long-term impact, the same way that Circus Kathmandu is built around storytelling and really challenging the narratives. Not saying that this is there's no simple answer. I think it happens because, there's a long line of reasons, and also there's a need there. So it's trying to address that in the complexity of it.
And there is a lack of understanding of the consequences of what happens. And I think that's why education is such a big part of what they're doing, so that people know what's happening when it happens. Yeah. I think because things are unfolding as they're unfolding, we planned lots of different films along the way, and one of them finished somewhere near the beginning of this one, so, and I think, it took much, much longer than we ever planned, but actually, I think in the end that's been a strength, even though we wanted to finish it much more quickly because we, our own capacity to make it, in the end, I think it's developed with them and with our relationship with them, and with their mission as people and as a company, and so as their mission developed after the earthquake, that's where the film went, and actually it feels like it went full circle in the end.
And I think it also, like a while before that, I think we'd sort of realised that the film it needed to tell itself somehow, that we were sort of going, it needs to be like this, and there was a point where we were like, this is just going to have to be what it's going to be, and it's going to take, to some degree, how long it's going to take. But so I think at that point we were like, this is the story, and we've got to go and do the best we can do with it. But I think it was a massive turning point for them from, to take that stage actually and become advocates and to really kind of go back into their communities. And I think we wanted to tell that to
and also the earthquake massively exacerbated all the problems that we touch on throughout the film, and that they would begin to tackle, have always been tackling, and are victims of. The poverty, the trafficking spiked, and so that was a part of the story too, and they were also taking that on board in their work.
And I think it did change things in that they lost their training space, and they also lost all the regular income that they'd built up as circus performers, because suddenly people were diverting any kind of income they had to relief missions. So for a young company that was building up its ability to be sustainable, it took them, they were halfway there, and it took them back to zero. So actually in knowledge of that and seeing their response and taking this active role in the rehabilitation of the country, I think that's really, it's really amazing. And worth noting that if you do want to support Circus Kathmandu and find out more about what they do, there is more information on our website, and fundraising for a training space is right up there with the things that is most important to them. So
I think we've run out of time for more questions, but to wrap up, can you tell us how can we engage with the film further? It's coming out in cinemas in the UK next Friday the 13th. The website is evenwhenitfall.com. What else can we do to continue the journey with the film?
Well, so we're putting this film in cinemas ourselves. It's been a long journey, and I think part of that journey has been, we did a crowdfunding campaign before we got any major funders on board, and I'm sure, who was part of...
Hands up, who supported the Kickstarter?
Who supported our Kickstarter campaign?
Wow, loads of people.
Well, I hope you're as proud of the film as we are, and thank you so much for believing in it.
Yeah.
And one of the amazing things about working in documentary is that you enter a different world. So for me, circus wasn't something I knew anything about. And there was one saying I learnt, which I really loved, and I think summarizes this film quite well, which is that alone you go further, but together you go... alone you go faster, but together you go further. And I think that really summarizes what we've made with this film in a sense. And so what I want to tell you, this 300-strong audience, is that every single one of you could tell someone about this film. And if you do, hopefully encourage them to go to the cinema next Friday and help us spread this message.
There's also loads of people here who contributed to the film as crew, so many people who supported us personally, friends and family, and I think we just all want to thank everybody.
Thank you,
because you're all part of it.
Yeah.
Thank you for making the film and for giving your time to us tonight. And thanks to everyone in the audience who
Thanks for
supported the
coming.
film at different stages.